Welcome to A Sustainable Energy Future for Africa, a podcast series offered by the African School of Regulation, ASR. The ASR aims to be a center of excellence for independent discussions and knowledge exchange. Our purpose is to improve the quality of African energy regulation and policy. This podcast will bring together energy experts and emerging energy leaders to discuss current topics of interest for the energy sector on the African continent over multiple episodes. The first season of the podcast focuses on energy access, the major immediate challenge faced by the energy sector of many countries in Africa. We explore whether universal energy access by 2030 is possible in Africa. My name is Christine Juta, your host in this series of podcasts. I am a clean energy professional with a strong commitment to advancing universal energy access towards sustainable economic growth in Africa. Today, we discuss Sustainable Development Goal 7, one of 17 SDG goals established by the United Nations General Assembly in 2015. SDG 7 aims to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. But is SDG 7 within reach? To discuss this, I'm joined by Ifey Ikeonu, who has extensive experience in energy law, policy markets, and regulation. Ifey has spent the past 6 years as a consultant providing advisory services to governments, as well as public and private institutions in various countries in Africa on electricity policy, markets, and regulation. Prior to embarking on consultancy work, Ifey worked as a regulator in Nigeria and also served as the chairperson of the ECOWAS Regional Electricity Regulatory Authority. Ifey, thank you for joining us and welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christine, for having me.
Okay, so my first question for you, Ifey, is Africa on track to achieving universal access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services by 2030, or is this a pipe dream? And perhaps should the answer be differentiated among countries?
Yeah, Christine, as you know, Africa remains the continent that has the lowest access to modern energy services, globally. And even though, certain strides have been made over the last decade or so to bridge this gap, it still remains a very daunting task. As we speak today, over 600 million in Africa, over 600 million people in Africa do not have access to electricity services. And even when it comes to modern clean cooking, we have numbers even much higher, getting to almost 1 billion people without access to modern clean cooking. So where then does that lie, Africa, in terms of moving towards the universal access goals that have been set for 2030? 2030, like we know, is maybe 6 years down the line, basically. And is it really a realistic target, which is the question that you have asked? My take, first of all, would be maybe starting from the second part of the question in terms of differentiating among the countries. Indeed, Africa is as diverse as the continent is large, basically. So we have differences, all the way from Northern Africa, the Maghreb region, coming all the way to Southern Africa or the Sub-Saharan African region. And the difference is really huge, going to countries like South Sudan with access rates of about 5% to electricity, to countries in the further north, Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, that have been able to attain universal access. So the story is not the same. So I think I want to, first of all, highlight that, to say that it's not the same. And again, even in terms of progress as well, it's also not the same story, because there are countries in the region that have, made tremendous efforts towards bridging the gap. You look at Ghana, you look at Rwanda, and you also look at what is happening in Kenya today. But largely, to a large extent, I think that we'll have challenges for most countries in Sub-Saharan Africa to meet these 2030 targets of access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services. And why is this so? I think, first of all, the story, of course, have been the challenges with investment, basically. So we have a region where most of the utilities are still largely state-owned. That is owned by governments. They are not being run very prudently. And governments obviously have all kinds of conflicting needs when it comes to infrastructure development, in all of the African countries. So energy itself, as important as it is also struggling for resources with other equally important areas like health, agriculture, education, and other infrastructure development. So that is a big problem. And that is where the role of the private sector comes in being the key sector to drive this energy transition and move Africa towards ensuring that at least we do begin to make sure that the goals or that the targets of universal access, is met. Again, in this regard, obviously, even though that we have a situation where a number of countries actually have a lot of private power companies currently in operation, we have regulators in place, we've tried to put in enabling frameworks that would attract private sector investment. Still, there have been a lot of challenges in this area. A lot of challenges in the sense that I think a big gap is what I would like to say, actually implementing what we have put in place as policies, as legal and regulatory framework into real action, basically. So you have countries that have put in place good energy laws, have established regulators, have also put in place some of these enabling policies that ought to drive investment and ensure that we have the private sector participation that will help to bridge this gap. But yet at the implementation level, there still remains a very, very big gap. So to the extent that we have all of these challenges, it may be difficult to attain the 2030 objective. And maybe also to chip in here that remember that largely energy remains a key driver for the development, that is for the economic and social development of any given country. So what it simply means is that access to clean energy services, modern, affordable energy services is an imperative for economic growth. So because of the absence of all of this in a number of countries in Africa, we have not seen the kind of growth that we would require to have countries in Africa achieve the best potential in terms of economic growth. So what this also means is that this also impedes on the affordability, of people to actually pay what would be described as cost-reflective tariffs, which are very, very imperative as a stimulant to ensuring that our electricity sector especially remains sustainable over the course of years that would enable us march purposefully towards this goal for universal access. So to the extent that we have a lot of poverty, within the region, and perhaps there's a lot more that needs to be done to raise people out of that poverty space to enable us stimulate demand for energy, because Africa also has the lowest per capita consumption of electricity. And like all commodities, the more it is consumed, then the cheaper it becomes, and the more it also helps to drive development in other sectors. So I think that the energy sector must be looked at collectively, within the economic development of all of the countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. If governments realize the very important part that energy plays in stimulating economic growth and really focus on ensuring that we do more to build up the electricity sector, the energy sector, what that also does is that it provides for more economic empowerment, gives people access to more funds, to more disposable income, to be able to consume more, and to also to be able to grow the sector. So in a nutshell, are we able to reach this by 2030? I think, yes, that for some countries, it will be possible. But I am not very optimistic that as a continent, that all of the countries within Africa would be able to reach the universal access goal by 2030 because of some of these reasons that I have discussed here, and of course, others which perhaps time would not allow us to elaborate upon. But just to add that it is important that regardless of whether we meet it by 2030 or maybe shortly afterwards, focus, strategic planning, and ensuring, more importantly, that we implement all of these plans that are put together are critical in ensuring that we create the governance space and ecosystem that is required to ensure that we can indeed, at some point in the nearest future, attain the target of universal access to modern energy services by all in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ifey, for that in-depth and realistic take on what really it entails to achieve this insurmountable task that is African countries are faced with, and also just pointing to the importance of a holistic approach to tackling SDG 7 in order to ensure that we are able to meet targets. My second question for you really wants to zero in on the specific targets for SDG 7. As you are aware, SDG 7 targets to achieve universal access to energy and also substantially increase the share of renewables, as well as doubling the growth rate of improvement in energy efficiency, all by 2030. Would you say these are competing needs for Africa? Are they of equal importance to Africa? And perhaps which of these is more difficult to achieve?
I would say that the SDG 7 targets, of energy access, renewable energy, and energy efficiency, in my view, are really complementary targets, and they should work together to solve the huge energy needs we have in Africa. I don't really see them as being competing, but more like complementary. And like I said, with Africa having the lowest access rate to energy in the world today, achieving a universal access would, of course, include using different sources of energy generation. And for us as a continent, we are blessed with, numerous renewable energy resources, basically. And indeed, when you look at our solar potentials, for instance, Africa, has potentials to generate up to about 60% or more of the solar potentials you have globally, just coming from one continent. So what this simply means is that we can use these renewable energy resources to solve the energy access problem, which again is one of the targets of the SDG goals, essentially. So what this means, again, for me, is that we have to find a way of working in a complementary manner to ensure that not only are we able to harness the renewable energy resources which we have in abundance, so be it solar, wind, geothermal, and the rest of it, but that even as we work towards achieving energy access, energy efficiency also becomes important, because right now we have a situation where in most countries, energy demand far outstrips energy supply. So it simply means that even with the limited energy, especially electricity that is available today, there must be more concerted efforts towards energy efficiency. And I dare say that out of these three goals, I think energy efficiency has somewhat, not been pushed as much as the other two goals, even though I consider it as equally important, especially for us here, where I keep saying that there's a huge gap between demand and supply. So in terms of which of these would be the most difficult to achieve, I know clearly that given the renewable energy resources we have on the continent, over the last few years, tremendous strides have been made in renewable energy. More and more countries have actually begun to tap into all of those resources as a way of solving energy needs, especially in our rural communities where energy access remains the lowest. So to that extent, I see renewable energy playing a very, very important role. And I do believe that over the next few years, perhaps we'll be able to do a lot more in terms of tapping into other renewable energy resources outside of hydro that today still remains most of the resource we use when it comes to renewable energy. So to that extent, I think that renewable energy is like, I think I will call it like a low-hanging fruit in the sense that it's really there, it's available, the resources are there, and it's very easy to plug into them. I also think that when it comes to energy efficiency, the biggest challenge we have today, I dare say, might even be in the area of capacity. You don't see too many policies or regulatory framework that address energy efficiency, perhaps in a manner that we ought to today, basically. Again, maybe because I can say that there has been so much emphasis on trying to focus on increasing access, basically. So energy efficiency, I think, may ultimately be the more difficult of the three to achieve. Maybe because in terms of priority, it may be considered maybe, well, I don't say less important, but not as obvious as energy access and as renewable energy, given the fact that renewable energy itself is also part of the kind of resources that you use in dealing with the energy access challenge, basically. And of course, with all of the challenges in terms of climate change and the need to mitigate CO2 emissions, and the emphasis on actually using cleaner energy resources. So much focus is being done in these two areas. Energy efficiency, like I said, hasn't gotten that much attention. I do not think it will be difficult to achieve, perhaps if a lot more focus is given, on energy efficiency over the years. So I do not think it's more like a difficulty in achieving it, but more or less that it's been somewhat neglected amongst these two other goals. But I think that it's really an area that there is need to focus more on, because remember that we have challenges in the region in terms of high cost of fuel. So of course, when you're talking about energy efficiency, it surely would help in reducing fuel imports. It's going to help in the reduction of existing infrastructure. And most importantly, I think on the issue of affordability, because I keep saying that we come from a region where disposable means of income is highly limited. So we have to find ways of promoting energy efficiency as one of the fundamental goals so that holistically we are able to deal and attain the SDG 7 goals. So again, all of them very, very important, all of them achievable, but I will just say that we haven't done as much in the area of energy efficiency as perhaps we've done in the area of renewable energy and also in energy access generally.
Thank you, Ifey. So far, we have spoken about the goals of SDG 7, how we're faring as the African continent in attaining these, and perhaps what are the considerations for the different targets that SDG 7 sets. In your view, how can energy regulation and capacity building in energy regulation help in achieving these goals?
I think underlying a lot of the challenges we have when it comes to implementing the SDG 7 goals is the issue of governance. And recall that when you talk about regulation, it's all about governance. It's all about putting in place the enabling framework that would not only support investments in the sector, but would also ensure that both the end users, the government, policymakers, as well as the private sector practitioners who are part of growing the energy sector feel sufficiently satisfied with the way the sector itself is progressing. So what it simply means is that when people come into a space to invest in the energy sector, whether it's electricity, whether it's clean cooking, EVs and the rest of it, the first thing or the first questions that usually would be asked is what are the enabling legal and regulatory framework for the sector? Is there a regulator in place who would serve as an impartial referee in terms of any disputes? Are the rules of the sector clearly specified in regulations, in rules, and in orders that can clearly be seen? And again, in a sector where we usually have a lot of participation from state-owned enterprises, would the rule of the game be fair? Is there a level playing ground for all of the participants, whether they are privately owned or publicly owned companies? So that is where regulation comes in. I remember again that we have talked about issues of tariffs, cost-reflective tariffs. It is the regulator who has a role of ensuring that you put in place cost-reflective tariffs, and also, for instance, working with governments in terms of putting in place subsidies for vulnerable customers or customers who may be on the lower end of the rung and may not be able to afford access to electricity. It is also the regulator who would ensure that you put in place the quality of service regulations that are required to make sure that service delivery is optimized, and also protect the service providers by ensuring that the end users also pay a fair cost for services provided. So that is why I think that the role of regulation is really, really important if we're going to achieve the SDG 7 goals. You need the regulators to ensure that you bring investments into the sector. You need the regulators to ensure that even when people are participating in the sector, that the rules are clear and that they get a fair return on their investment, and that the end users also have access to affordable and reliable supply of electricity. We also need the regulator to ensure that even for those who are vulnerable and may not otherwise be able to afford electricity or access to modern energy services, that there are government policies that are put in place to support, those cadre of customers. And this brings me into the realm of capacity building, because a knowledgeable regulator is the one who has sufficient capacity to understand the dynamics of the entire sector. If you recall at the beginning, I had said that the energy sector cannot be treated in isolation. So what it simply means is that there are certain cross-cutting issues that needs to be clearly understood by people who have been called upon to serve as regulators in order to provide the kind of effective and efficient regulatory interventions that would be needed to bring in the resources and to sustain the sector, to ensure that it continues to grow and continues to provide the kind of catalysts that would that would drive economic growth within the entire country. From experience, having worked as a regulator first, and having spent the last few years working with both government ministries and regulatory commissions, I see clearly that there's still a need, a lot of gap, in terms of capacity, especially as within the regulatory commissions. This is obviously not very surprising, because electricity sector or energy sector regulation in Africa is still new, it's still novel in a number of countries. We have countries, lots and lots of countries that have probably had their regulatory commission set up in the last 5 years, basically. So what it simply means is that there's a dearth of capacity. But again, conversely, there are also other countries that have had their regulatory commissions much longer, have built capacity, have built experience in those areas. So for me, capacity building is very critical, because you cannot regulate a sector if you do not understand clearly how that sector functions. You also need to be very, very up to date in terms of all of the emerging technologies and changes in the energy sector. Today, we are talking about hydrogen, electric vehicles, battery storage, things that were not discussed in the last 10 years, but all of these are playing very prominent roles today in the energy sector. So knowledge is important and not just a one-off thing. I think that continuing education, especially for regulators, is very, very important. And likewise, let me not also just say for the regulators, for the utility operators, for the ministries, and for all people who are involved in the energy sector. The emphasis I have put on the regulators simply is because generally, it is the role of the regulator to oversee the sector. So more than any other person, that capacity is required, but it must be across board. You must have utility practitioners who are constantly trained. We must have our ministries who are responsible for setting the policies, and the laws are also on the same page when it comes to capacity building. So yes, I think that the role of regulation and capacity building is indispensable when it comes to attaining the SDG 7 goals, especially in Africa today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ifey, for really placing emphasis on the importance of regulatory governance issues in order to create, as you put it, a level playing field that will allow private investment to flow to complement efforts by African governments towards attaining the goals of SDG 7. And importantly, as you said, there's a need for continuous capacity building for regulators, especially because on the other hand, regulatory entities are fairly new in some African countries, but also because of the evolving nature of the energy sector and the rapid pace of innovation, especially in business models and new technologies that are emerging, which have implications for how approaches to energy regulation. So there's definitely a need for that continuous capacity building. Thank you very much, Ifey, for your contributions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Catherine, for having me.
Our second guest for this episode is Victor Otieno, an Energy Access Research Associate at the World Resources Institute, WRI. Victor, thank you for joining us and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Christine, for the invitation to participate in this podcast. And I hope that we are going to have an impactful discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so, we've listened to the submissions from Ifey Ikeonu, and I want to hear from you, Victor. Given that average energy consumption per capita in most African countries is well below the world average, how is this impacting on the expectations of young generations regarding their future? Do you think that, do you see any encouraging developments or initiatives that can motivate young African people to hope for a better future in your perspective?
Thanks a lot, Christine, for the question. I think that's a very important question in the context where we are sitting as Africa. Maybe we can start from the point of view of what energy consumption per capita is, just basically, and not going into so much over detail, can be understood as a measure of how much energy a county uses per person. The energy that the county consumes divided by the population. So that would give us a rough estimate of how much a person uses, and that's what we refer to as energy consumption per capita. So you are right, just as you have indicated, that Africa really falls so much below the world average, actually. Sub-Saharan Africa, without including South Africa, is around 180 kilowatt hours per person per year annually. So that's really, really low. And if you compare this with countries that have developed, for example, US is 13,000 and Europe in average is around 6,500 kilowatt hours annually, then we are very, very much behind. So potentially, yes, some of the causes that would lead to this might include our low energy demand because it's what we consume divided by the population. So it means that we consume little, and this might relate to things that include energy access and our disposable income. And in the energy access space, that also lack of energy, which is sufficient to stimulate productive uses, because energy is an input of development. So that speaks negatively to our situation as Africa and as youths. That's really negative, because a low economic activity would mean low jobs, would mean low income, and our future is not right. But with that said, that is poised to change, because there's a lot that is happening. Our population is growing. Our economic activity is also increasing, and therefore our demand for energy services would also be able to increase along with it. And just to add a little bit, I think what is happening currently in the space as far as the future is concerned, the energy access side of things, the definition majorly is whether connected to electricity, for example, in this case, or not, which does not give us really a good picture of what's happening. So there's a lot of activities that are happening, trying to redefine what energy access means. And the major thing that I would pick is energy access would mean access that is sufficient to stimulate economic activities, especially on the side of the productive uses. So beyond the household, the energy access should also focus on the productive uses. And there's a lot that is happening in that area, especially maybe just a few examples. Beyond the Grid Fund of Africa is supporting productive uses. There is powering renewable energy opportunities. There's also Energy and Environment Partnership Fund, EEP Africa. And even at Tabarai, we are working with partners to come up with an energy productive use fund so that we'll be able to stimulate economic activities around that. At the same time, increase income and also increase our demand for energy. Beyond that, even the multinationals, development bank like the African Development Bank is not left behind. Through the Lighting Up Africa, there's a lot that is happening. So we should not lose hope, even though our situation is still low, but there's a lot of activities that are happening that we're able to open up this space. It is now upon us, those who are still young, because these opportunities will target more the youth, will target more the women. So we should package ourselves and prepare ourselves to tap into these opportunities and be able to drive the economic situation of our countries. Kristen.
Thank you very much, Victor, for really placing emphasis on the importance of productive uses of energy, which I think is very important, particularly given the significant demographic of youth in Africa and the expected growth of this population. I think it's going to be quite critical for the future of Africa and for our sustainable development. I would like to thank our guests, Ifey and Victor, for your time and insightful contributions. And I hope our listeners enjoyed this episode of A Sustainable Energy Future for Africa. If you'd like to listen to more episodes or find out more about the African School of Regulation, visit africanschoolofregulation.org.